It was a few weeks ago on a Wednesday evening in the dining hall. I was doing my routine rounds, visiting with the people who were eating there. When I came by Ethel Ewer's table, this nice, quiet lady picked up the First Family News, pointed to the list of summer preachers who are filling in for our pastor's sabbatical, and asked me point blank, "Are you going to let us down?" I was taken back, not by the way she asked, but by the weight of the question. I steadied myself, looked back into her eyes, said, "Ethel, I don't know. Please pray for me, and I will do my best." So I brought some cucumbers from my garden, organic, fresh. After the service, if you come up to me and tell me you really like my sermon, and that I will give you one for free. But I am really excited to stand behind this pulpit. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Romans 1:16. Remember your first conversion experience? If you don't, or never had one, at the end of the service, you're invited to come up to the altar. Just to be sure, we'll dunk you in the James River. You know I was kidding, right? Just to be sure. But let me tell you my conversion story. I grew up in China in an atheist family. In 1999, I came to the US and studied at Illinois State University. One night, an American girl who lived in my dorm invited me to attend an InterVarsity gathering. So I went, and the people were real friendly. I made some friends there, and they invited me to go to church with them, and I did. So this went on for several months, and I became increasingly interested in Christianity. But I told myself, I am not becoming a Christian until all my questions were answered. I was reading the Bible, and I had lots of questions. And then one evening, at a poetry contest on campus, I read a poem that I wrote. I talked about growing up. I talked about my guilt and the shame and unhappy events in my life. I was hoping to win the $200 prize money. Of course, I didn't win. But after I came back to my dorm room, I broke down. The heaviness of the journey weighed on me. I cried out to Jesus because that's what my Christian friends told me. If I accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior, and He will forgive my sins. After that, I went to my friends and told them what happened. They circled themselves around me, and with tears in their eyes, they prayed for me. And that was April 4th, 2002, 12 years ago. It may not be overstating to say that the reason you and I are here today, worshiping together as children of God, under one roof, no matter if we're Asian, Caucasian, African descent, rich or poor, is because of one man who was so completely, so stubbornly dedicated to bringing the gospel to the Gentiles, the non-Jews, that he was considered the most influential missionary in Christian history. It all started on the road to Damascus. Unusual things tend to happen when we travel, do they? The traveler was a young man named Saul. He was on a mission, going to synagogues in Damascus to arrest the followers of the Way, who were spreading this stirring theory that a Nazarene named Jesus was the Messiah, the one whom the prophets had prophesied about. Well, just another con artist trying to get attention for himself and make trouble for all the Jews. The Romans were already suspicious of any commotion. But the strange thing was, since his crucifixion 2 years ago, his followers claimed that he had risen from the dead, and many naive Jews had believed him. It was noon. The road was dusty and quiet, and you could hear your own footsteps and breathing. All of a sudden, a light from heaven covered Saul, and the voice called out, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." For 3 days, Paul was blind. When he regained his vision, he was a different person. He was filled with the Holy Spirit, and he began to proclaim that Jesus is the Son of God. This new man was Paul, Saul in Latin spelling. For from now on, his purpose in life was to preach the good news of salvation to the Gentiles. We must imagine what a paradigm shift Paul went through in order to appreciate him appropriately. As a Pharisee, Paul was circumcised on the 8th day and kept his Jewish law to the T all his life. His most fundamental Jewish understanding, passed on from generation to generation, was the belief that God made a covenant with his ancestors. God set them apart, and God gave them the law to live by. We don't know what went on in Paul's mind in the darkest 3 days of his life. But we do know that Paul, even as a hardcore Pharisee, couldn't resist the illumination of that divine light. But who can? Paul had longed to visit the Roman church, but was never able to do so. He hoped he could stop by Rome on his mission trip to Spain. In his letter to the Romans, he offered theological and spiritual insights to strengthen the church there. An urgent task the infant Roman church faced was how to get Jews and the Gentiles worship Jesus together. Seriously, how could you make two groups of people who had despised each other for thousands of years to do church together? On top of that, they each brought with them drastically different cultures, religious practices, and worldviews. Circumcision was one of the hot buttons. Should we circumcise Gentile converts? People had different opinions. Should we allow Gentile converts to eat meat offered to pagan gods? Some Jews were okay with it, but some were disgusted by it. And this was not a small issue. Some Gentiles wouldn't get to eat any meat if they didn't eat sacrificed meat. In this kind of context, in verses 12 to 16, Paul urges the Roman church to live by the Spirit. Because as God's children, we all receive His Spirit. And this should be the most fundamental trait that we share, not the law-keeping. We may come from different backgrounds, we may have different views, but we all possess the same Spirit. So, don't stress about circumcision. Don't worry about what foods are clean and what weren't. God created them all, and they are all good. But don't pass judgment if people think differently. Give people room. Be sensitive to people's differences and focus on what we share in common. Being church has not gotten easier 2,000 years later, has it? With the overloading of information, choices, and resources, people have become increasingly diverse. First Baptist Church is filled with people of different backgrounds, opinions, and tastes. But we seem to have managed to walk with one another, don't we? In our 234 years history, we have not split once. And we have only had 16 senior pastors. And that says a lot. Yes, we hit some rough spots. We have issues. But we have not thrown in the towel. I think that's because we have managed to focus on what we share in common. How do we justify suffering if we're indeed children of God? We wonder how much the Roman Church struggled with this question. As a small infant sect consisting of a group of minorities in a hostile society, the hardship the believers faced must be extraordinary. In year 8049, Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome because of the riot caused by the conflict between Jews and the Jewish Christians. A few years later, the new emperor, Nero, allowed the Jews to return. Imagine all that uprooting, settling, and resettling. How do we justify suffering if we are indeed heirs of God? In verse 17, Paul argues that as children of God, our right to God's blessings also obligates us to the responsibility of suffering with His Son, Jesus Christ. Remember the Abba, Father phrase in verse 15? It is Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane on the night He was betrayed. The fact that we can imitate Christ by calling God Abba in our deepest troubles indicates that we indeed share our children's status alongside Christ. But on the other side of the coin, we are also invited to imitate Christ in His suffering, His cross, His crucifixion, and ministry. Suffering with Christ may have another layer of meaning. 2 weeks ago, I attended the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship annual gathering in Atlanta with my husband and father-in-law. At a Virginia State meeting, I heard Jenny Jenkins, a missionary to Haiti. By the way, she was baptized here, and her parents were both ministers at our church years ago, Bart and Lucy Dorr. Some of you may know them. And Jenny shared how she heard God's call. When Jenny was a nurse in New York City, she felt nudged to go on a mission trip for several years. Finally, she took a medical mission trip to Haiti. She had a wonderful experience, so she went again. And on her third trip to Haiti, she ministered with a group along small beachfront villages to care for people who had no access to medical care. One man with an inflected leg weighed on Jenny's mind as her group prepared to leave. So Jenny found some drug and went back to check on him one last time. Being a nurse, Jenny had learned to focus on the task at hand. As she knelt in the dirt and wrapped this man's leg in fresh bandages, the man held Jenny's face in her hands and said, "Merci," thank you, in Creole, the Haitian language. That night, Jenny sat alone on the beach and wept. She knew her life had been forever changed in that moment when she heard "Merci" and looked up at the man's eyes. She had looked into the eyes of Christ. On January 12, 2010, when the big earthquake shook Haiti, Jenny traveled to Haiti immediately to help. A few months later, she was commissioned as one of CBF's self-funded field personnel. Do we hear the music in Paul's message, reaching a crescendo in verses 18 to 25? After discussing the necessity of suffering, Paul announces in a compelling voice that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory to come. For the whole creation will be set free from its bondage to decay and brought into glorious freedom. What a grand cosmic view of salvation! God's redemption is not just for human beings, but extends to the whole universe. Everything will be restored. The earth, the sun, the stars, the plants, the animals, your dogs and cats. In the very, very end, everything will be brought under the perfect reign of God. It is not easy to hope like Paul hoped. We don't know how exactly this could happen. We don't know how exactly God will work out the details. But perhaps we shouldn't worry too much about how God will do his job. It was last spring. The church got a call from a memory care facility about a lady who was dying. This lady was old, single, and had no family around. She was a First Baptist church member. So her friend called the church to send a minister to visit her before her passing. I needed some pastoral care experience. So Steve Booth, my boss, took me with him to visit this lady. As we walked into the facility and found her room, I was anticipating a withering, sickly, pitiful old lady lying in her bed and hanging on with only a shred of breath. But when we walked into her room, I found the lady soundly asleep. She looked perfectly fine, didn't seem to have any sign of illness. Her face was radiant with peace. I said to myself, surely she was not dying. How about you pray for her, Steve suggested, as he was always an intentional teacher. So I prayed for her in her sleep, and Steve gently put his hand over her body. Somehow, I didn't feel comfortable touching her, so I didn't. The next morning, the news came. She passed. Hours after I prayed for her. For several days, I felt her presence, her sweetness, and the peace. I didn't touch her, but boy, she surely touched me in a powerful way. I felt I had acquainted death a bit, and I felt I was not afraid of death as before because of my encounter with her spirit in her last hours. 2 days later, my husband, who is a newspaper nut and a faithful obituary reader, cut out something from the newspaper, and he handed me an obituary and said, "Look, this is the lady you've been talking about." It was Vashti Hammett, a member of the former Gwen Day Sunday class. Some of you may remember her. Last week, I dug out her obituary from my drawer. It reads, Hammett Vashti, 95, passed away on April 3rd, 2013. Vashti went to heaven prepared with her pockets full of dog biscuits and cat treats. There were also a few peanut butter cups for herself. She is survived by her neighbors and dear friends, as well as her beloved cats, Rufy, PJ, Oliver, and Fitz. Vashti grew up on the farm in Falmouth, Virginia, and attended Falmouth High School class of 1935. She graduated from Mary Washington College and received her Master's of Education from the University of Virginia. It rained on her graduation day, and she never got to take the official walk across the lawn. Perhaps she took that walk today. Vashti was a guidance counselor at Stafford High School for 20 years, and then became a counselor at Thomas Jefferson High School in Richmond. Vashti was a collector of many things and was known as the neighborhood SPCA. She brought together a group of neighbors and friends that will always share a special bond because of her. She has provided us with fabulous Vashti stories that we will share for years. In lieu of flowers, she should prefer that donations were made to the Southside SPCA, P.O. Box 66, Meherrin, Virginia, 23954. To God be the glory.